Hi there and welcome to the beginning of 1 Corinthians. Now, before we get into the passage, we just need to do a little bit of a contextual discussion about what we're going to do here through all of these videos. Probably the biggest challenge we have in reading anywhere in the Bible, certainly the New Testament as much as we can, is the difference between the world of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago to the world of today. And this is an obvious thing to state. If you've been studying the Bible for even 5 minutes, you'd recognize that it's a very different world to the one in which we live. And this presents for us challenges because it's very easy for us to read the Bible as a 21st century person. We think in a certain way, we have a certain worldview, we understand people and society in a way that's modern as opposed to how it was understood first century or 3 millennia ago when the Old Testament was being written. So we're going to look at a lot of this throughout the videos. What I want to do with each of the sections is to introduce the context, introduce what was going on in that world at the time that was informing the beliefs and the practices of the Corinthians, and also Paul's responses, because I think sometimes we can see Paul's response and say that seems quite cruel or quite unusual, or how do we do that today? But for him, that was a very normal thing to do, the way that he responded or the way that he expected the Corinthians to act. And so we need to really come to grips with that if we're to fully understand Scripture, but at the same time in doing that, it gives us a foundation by which we can then apply that to our modern world. So probably one of the biggest differences is in the way that we think today about a person as opposed to the way that people thought about people then. That being that in a modern world, in a 21st century world, we focus on the individual. We see people as individuals, and so we talk about individual rights and individual freedoms. And all of these are correct. All of these are good things. But that's a very modern idea. That's a very post-Enlightenment sort of idea. For the majority of human history, people didn't really see themselves as individuals. People didn't see the individual. What they saw was the group. They understood themselves and they understood each other within the context of the group in which they were a part. And this is a really fundamental difference between their world and our world, and certainly in the way that we understand ancient community and the Christian community in particular. So there were different sorts of groups you could be part of. There was your ethnic group, and that was obviously a major thing of which you were a part of, whether you're a Greek or whether you're a Roman or whether you're Jewish or whatever you might be. Your ethnicity strongly determined and helped to characterize who you were. The city from where you came from. And so you'll hear things like, Jesus of Nazareth or Paul of Tarsus. What's the significance of that? Well, within those cities, there are certain cultural values, there are certain ideals, worldviews that you would be expected to subscribe to. And so wherever you came from, that was important in determining how people were to understand you or how you were to understand yourself. The family, of course, the family is a major group to which you belong. And so you don't have surnames in the ancient world, you have your father's name. And so you would have Jesus, son of Joseph, or more importantly, Jesus, son of David. Who your father was, who your forefathers were, was so important. If you walk into any ancient Roman house, particularly amongst the elite, you walk into the atrium, the very first room in the house, and what you're faced with are wax busts of the forefathers, of your father, of the grandfathers, and so forth, all the way back, particularly for the honourable men. And the idea of this was to remind you who your group is, where you come from, and to give you something to aspire towards. These are the exemplars to which you should aspire to live. Another group to which you belong was your school, if you could afford to go to school, who your teacher was. And so Paul will say, my teacher was Gamaliel. Why would he say that? Well, because Gamaliel was a famous teacher, but more than that, it gave him a sense of identity. People would understand if you studied with Gamaliel, then that's going to give us a good sense of the sort of thinking that you'll have, the sort of person that you're going to be. Then beyond that, your personal networks, whether your friendships or your patronage groups, the voluntary associations that you might be a part of, whatever smaller individual groups in which you found yourself is, again, going to determine who you are, who you belong to, how you identify yourself. So mystery cults, etc. So there's lots of different groups to which you can belong. And if you didn't belong to a group, then you're really nobody. You didn't have an identity. So you were identified by who you were or who you spent your time with. And so it wasn't really a case of who you are, but rather to whom do you belong is really the best way to understand an ancient person. So when we come to the Christian community, it's no different. One of the modern terms that we use to describe the church is the church, which is a translation of the Greek word ekklesia. Now that's all good and well. It's a suitable translation of that term. But one of the challenges, one of the difficulties that we have with the word church is this sort of institutionalized idea. When we think of the church, we think of a building, we think of a Sunday service, we think of a minister or a priest or whatever that thing might be. And so we have very modern conceptions of that. That was never the case when this Christian movement first emerged. They understood themselves as the ekklesia, the called out ones from God. But what they saw themselves as, and what most historians will refer to this group as being, is the Christian community. Because that's precisely what they were. Within any city, you would find a Christian community, a small Christian community, never more than maybe a few dozen or maybe 100 people. In fact, the entirety of the Christian community in Corinth would have been about 100 people. It wasn't a mega church. And in fact, for the first century, there were only a few thousand Christians at all. It wasn't a massive worldwide, great big mega church movement. And so when you understand that, it starts to make more sense of the type of language that Paul uses to describe this community. The family. One of the more common ways in which Paul comes to understand this group is that we're a family, that we have brothers and sisters, fathers, mothers, and all this sort of language. And that's really important language because the family was such a central group. It was such the most important group to which you could belong. And so it's very natural then for Paul to say that's how we need to understand each other, because you would do anything for your family. You would die for your family. He also talks about it being a body. And so we look at that in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, 14. And this idea that we're all members of this greater organism. And that wasn't Paul's idea. We'll see this later on. Paul didn't come up with that idea. That's how ancient philosophers understood cities, that we're all members of this greater body. And so if one member hurts, all the members hurt. If you steal from one member, then that's going to damage the whole body. You ultimately suffer. Even if you're the one stealing, you will ultimately suffer as a result. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the coming videos. And another way that they came to understand themselves was as a school. They were something like a philosophical school. And again, in the coming videos, we'll start to unpack that idea a little bit more. And so you have a responsibility to your group. And this is a really important thing we have to recognize. One of your chief responsibilities, whatever group you find yourself in, one of your chief responsibilities is to maintain the honor of the group. Your job is to uphold the values of the group. That's your responsibility. If at any point your behavior is diminishing the value of the group, then you can expect a consequence, and that consequence is quite simply exile. You are no longer part of this group. You're no longer part of this city or this family or whatever it is that you're a part of. If you bring dishonor to that group, then you'll be exiled from that, because that's really the only punishment they had. In any given group, in anywhere you found yourself, whether it be from your family, your voluntary association, all the way up to the city, even up to being part of the Roman Empire, you could expect that any behavior that diminished the value of the group would result in exile. And so that's a really important one that we need to bear in mind, because as Paul is dealing with these issues that are cropping up in Corinth, what he keeps coming back to is this idea of you're either in or you're out. And if you're going to continue this behavior, then you can expect that you will no longer be welcome. Very difficult for us today to understand that. Put that back in the first century, perfectly normal. So anyway, that's just a little bit of an introduction, and we're going to see how that unpacks as we move into the rest of these videos. So stay with me and enjoy. there and welcome back. In the previous video, we talked briefly about this idea of community. So if we're going to understand who these Corinthians are, we have to understand them, of course, as the people of God, as Christians within Corinth. But we also have to understand what a Corinthian was, because a Corinthian was very different to an Athenian or to a Roman or to an Ephesian. Wherever you found yourself in these ancient cities, there were some differences between cultures, and that's no different today. If you live in Sydney, you're going to have some different values or different ideas to, if you live in New York or in wherever, London, Paris, you name it. We're going to have different languages, different culture, etc., etc. And so to understand what Paul is dealing with when he's writing to these Corinthians, we have to understand who a Corinthian is. And so we're going to spend this first session just looking at the history of Corinth and how the unique elements of the history of Corinth came to inform who these Corinthian Christians were. So very briefly, the history of Corinth goes back for thousands of years. Corinth was one of the earlier city-states of the Greek Empire, and so we won't go right into all of that information. But one very important event took place as the Roman Empire was beginning to rise. As Rome was becoming more powerful in the west, in the east, this empire that Alexander the Great had started was starting to diminish. And so that tension really started to manifest itself around Macedonia, because if you remember, Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, and so Macedonia was always sort of the spiritual heart of the Greek Empire. So as Rome is beginning to rise, the Macedonian kings are feeling threatened by this. And so through sort of mutual aggression, and as these warlords tend to be, it comes to conflict. And there were four major battles that took place over a span of sort of 214 to 148. There were four major battles that happened around Macedonia and I guess ultimately in the Greek Empire. The fourth of these really put to death what had been the Greek Empire. Now, the Greek Empire was still spreading through the east, if you're looking on the map, but Macedonia, once Macedonia falls, that's it. It's kind of like to win World War II, if you take out Berlin, everything else is going to collapse. So it was kind of that situation. So 148, Macedonia falls to the Romans and it becomes a Roman province. It becomes a Roman area. Well, the Greeks weren't going to take that line down, and so in the south, in the region of Achaia, where we find Corinth, the Achaean League decided to fight back against Rome, which was their first mistake. It's kind of like David trying to fight Goliath, except David doesn't have God on his side. It's not going to end well. And so the Corinthians decide that they're going to fight and they'll declare war on the Romans. So the Romans march into Corinth under the leadership of General Mummius. Not only do they defeat the Corinthians, they just completely level the city. Destroy it brick from brick. There's just nothing left of it. It's completely flattened, other than about 2 or 3 buildings which they leave standing. And everyone who lives in the city are either killed or taken into slavery. In fact, the desolation is so bad that it was just a ghost town for the next 100 years. There would have been maybe some hermits living there, but that was it. It was just a dead city for the next 100 years. Until 44 BC. One of the last things Julius Caesar did before he was assassinated was to set about to rebuild Corinth, for reasons that we're going to see in the coming videos. But Corinth was always a very important city in the context of the Mediterranean, and Caesar recognized that, and so one of the last decrees that he made was to refound Corinth. And so the refounded colony of Corinth takes the Latin title Colonia Laus Julia Corinthiensis, because when you found a city, you always name it after yourself, because, well, why wouldn't you? And so that became the capital of the region of Achaia. And one of the ideas, when you build a colony, you're actually building a mini Rome. The idea of the Roman Empire was never to come in and say, we're going to destroy you if you don't start being Roman. They were happy for you to carry on and be who you are. In fact, they took a lot of the ideas from the Greeks and called them and just turned them into Latin ideas of their own. So they were very happy for you to carry on and worship the gods that you've always worshipped. As long as you paid your taxes and you kept the peace, the Romans didn't care too much what you did. But one of the ways that they spread Roman culture, this process called Romanization, was to build colonies throughout the Roman world. So Philippi is one example, and Corinth is a great example of this process. What you do is you build a city based on Roman design, based on Roman architecture, with a Roman government system, and that city becomes loyal now to Rome. You get certain tax exemptions, and you get the privilege of being part of a Roman colony. And so even to be a citizen of that city is a very significant thing to have. And so Corinth became one of these cities with the idea of spreading Roman culture, but also to be a place by which you could come to get access to Rome. Because if you wanted to get power, well, all the power's in Rome. So if you wanted to get access to Rome, well, then you come to Corinth, because that's where the governor is, that's where the seat of power lies. So very quickly, it's just a few historical things about it. So the city itself, very large city in the context of its time, about 100,000 people. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think that Rome itself was a city of 1 million people, and that was the largest city that the world had ever seen. In fact, you didn't see a city that big again until Victorian England. So a city of 1 million people was just exceptionally massive. So 100,000 people, that's a good sized city, and growing all the time. By the time Paul got there, it's a city of over 100,000 people. It's a massive city, continually growing because of the advantages that it offers. One of those advantages is the fact that it's a trade city. It's a very market-driven city. They don't produce a lot of their own materials, a lot of their own goods, but because of the trade coming through it, and we'll talk a bit more about this, it was a very wealthy city, or it was a place that you could come and make some wealth. Now, if you're looking at the picture there, what you see is this road the main road leading into Corinth. So, very important city. If you go to the city today, you'll see some of the archaeological remains. Here's the remains of a shop right there in the middle of the forum, so right in the center of the town. That would have had 2 stories. The bottom story would have been the workshop, and above would have been where people lived. Another thing to remember too, there's no sense of, a workplace and a home place. It's all the same thing. You live where you work where you live. It's all integrated into the family life. So you always live in the shop in which you work or trade or whatever it is that you do. One of the really famous products that Corinth produced was Corinthian bronze. And so you see this turn up in the ancient sources all the time. It's not just that it's made of bronze, it's made of Corinthian bronze. It's a bit like buying a leather jacket or buying a Burberry leather jacket. It's all leather, but it's Burberry. What makes it better? It's Burberry. What's it got to do with that? It says Burberry. My wife cares more about that sort of stuff, I don't know. Anyway, here's a great example of a Corinthian bronze mirror, and we'll see this. Paul's really good at using metaphors, and we see this throughout the letters. One of the metaphors that he uses is that he says, we see as in a dim mirror. What does he mean by that? Well, he simply means a bronze mirror. Now, I've never looked into a bronze mirror, but I can imagine that it's going to make me look really yellow. I'm going to see a bit of a reflection of myself. If it's really polished up well, I'll get a bit of a reflection of myself, but it's not going to be a true reflection like a glass mirror. So Paul says, we see right now in part. We see as in a bronze mirror. It's not the full picture, but it gives us an idea of what it is. Another important element of Corinth, when we'll see a map soon of closer in, Corinth was a militarily strategic location. All travel from the north to the south through Greece all came through Corinth. And so this particular mountain here, the Acrocorinth, if you control that mountain, you control the region. And so to have that is to have power over the whole area. And even today, you can still go up and climb through the ancient forts because every subsequent empire recognized that that's the hill that you needed to control. So to control Corinth, strategically, militarily, you control the whole region. But really importantly, we have to recognize this, and this is what we'll finish on. Corinth was like every other city of the ancient world. You're going to hear sermons preached, or you're going to read older commentaries that say, the Corinthians were particularly bad. They were particularly disgusting, sexually immoral types of people. Not really. They were terrible, don't get me wrong. But everybody was terrible in the first century. Sexual immorality, as we understand it, was just sex in the ancient world. And again, we're going to see lots of examples of this through the letter. But the Corinthians weren't any different to anybody else in that time. One great example of this, here we've got a floor mosaic out of what was the drinking room of a very wealthy person's house. Now the photo doesn't quite do the scale of it, but that's about a 6-foot tall tile mosaic. And in the middle of it, well, if you look on the corners, you've got these wine goblets. And in the middle of it, you've got a picture of Dionysius, who is the god of theatre and the god of wine. So basically he's the god of the party. And if you look at the detail there of these hand-cut tiles, it's absolutely exquisite. That's how you have to imagine the typical wealthy family of Corinth and of the entire world at that time. It's a lot of wine, it's a lot of food, it's a lot of sex, and that's just generally how you do society. That's just generally how you engage with the rest of your world. So Corinth is very important to understand. Like any other city of the ancient world, just like all the people of that time. And again, we'll unpack this more as the years go on. But we'll finish that one for the moment. Hey there and welcome back. So we're going to pick up directly from the previous video. We're just sort of laying out some of the historical elements of the ancient city of Corinth. And so we've looked at the size of the city, the fact that it was a trade, it was a market-driven city, which is particularly important when Paul comes through as the tent maker. There's good money to be made if you've got a trade. Militarily, it was a very strategic location, and more importantly, culturally, it was like any other city in the ancient world. The idea is that it's a mini Rome. When you go to Corinth, it's like you're in Rome. So if you understand anything about Rome, then you're going to have some sense of what it was like in Corinth. But one of the other things about Corinth was that it's a very historic city. It had been destroyed in 148. It had been refounded by Caesar in 44, but it was still, it had been a city for at least 2,000 years. It was one of the earliest cities of Greece. And so it still carried a lot of that history. When General Mummius came in and destroyed the city, he still left some of the original buildings standing. And one of them was this fountain. It's called the Glaucae Fountain. Really quick story. And one of the things you've got to recognize is that history and mythology in the Greek and Roman world are kind of one and the same. To understand their history, they understand it in a form of mythology. And so this particular fountain is an example of this. If you've heard about Jason and the Argonauts, the story there, Jason at one stage with his wife Medea came to Corinth and they were going to live there. After he'd done all of his adventures, they came to Corinth to settle down, to, have a sea change, whatever it was that they were trying to do. Now, that's all good and well. They've got their kids there and everything's fine and happy until Jason falls in love with the princess of Corinth. Now, that's pretty standard sort of behavior. I mean, the guys are just kind of, as we're going to see, they're going to have all of their women. They've got their wife and then they've got all their other women. But this is a sort of different thing, because to be married to the princess, well, that elevates your status. That you are now the son-in-law of the king. That's an important position to have. And so Medea finds out about him falling in love with the princess, and she's quite upset. And so he tries to arrange a compromise with her. He says, look, why don't I marry her as well? Because that way you get the shared status of being related to the king. Like, isn't that a good deal? Now she, like any woman, is going to go, no, to hell with you. That's just never going to happen. But she plays it cool. She says, all right, that's cool. You carry on and do your thing. In fact, he even goes and buys a wedding gift for the princess. A beautiful coat. Just maybe like a coloured coat, whatever it was. But what nobody realised was that she'd covered it in poison. And so when the princess put it on, she was poisoned and then she died. Now, very quickly people realised that it was Medea that had done this, and Jason now has the obligation to deal with her, to get rid of her, ideally to kill her, but to spare her life and to spare the lives of her sons, he dismisses her. So that's the story there. So what's that got to do with this fountain? Well, this is the Glaucae Fountain, and the name of the princess of Corinth was Glaucae. Whatever the connections they made there, but if you were an ancient person, you wanted to go and then see where Glaucae was from the story of mythology, that's a place that you could go. So you've got lots of historical things. It's a very tourist city, much like all parts of the world that have these ancient sort of buildings or ancient sort of structures. Like every city of the ancient world, Corinth is very polytheistic. everybody's polytheist. Everybody believes in many, many thousands of gods. Whatever particular combination of gods you have will be determined by whatever particular needs you have or whatever the gods of that particular city are. So for Corinth, like every other city, lots of different gods. The most important one for Corinth is the god Apollo. So if you've been to Athens, you can still go to Athens today and you can look up, you can see the Parthenon, and you see the temple there to Athena. Why Athena? Because Athena was the patron goddess of Athens, hence the name Athens. For Corinth, the patron god of Corinth was the twin brother of Athena, which is, I've got that mixed up. Twin brother of Artemis is the god Apollo. And so he's the chief god. He is the patron god of Corinth. And so when the Romans came in, they weren't going to destroy that temple because obviously Apollo wanted the Romans in there. Otherwise, they wouldn't have won. So the gods clearly favored Roman invasion. And so naturally they would come in and they would give honor to Apollo. In fact, Apollo was eventually believed to be the god who gave birth or who impregnated the mother of the Emperor Augustus. So he was kind of the son of Apollo. But anyway, that's his temple there. It's largely sort of fallen apart now, but that predated the Romans by many, many centuries. So one of the important things they do there is to not destroy that. Another thing you'll find in Corinth was the god Asclepius. Now, Asclepius was the god of healing. And what they found in Corinth are lots of these molds of various body parts. And there were some that are a little bit more, let's just say, the private parts. We'll only go that far. But the idea was that if you were sick, you'd go down to Asclepius' temple, you'd do the process to get your healing. Having been healed, you would then make a cast of whatever it was that was healed, whether it be your hand or your arm or whatever part it was, and you would bring that back to Asclepius as an offering to say thank you and whatever else. And so what they found in Corinth is just heaps and heaps of these body parts, these molds of these various parts, which is clear signs of how significant Asclepius was in Corinth. Here's another example of some feet, and again, I've got pictures of ones that probably just aren't appropriate for any context, really. But one of the new things that occurs, I'm going to talk a lot more about this in some later videos, was this thing called the imperial cult. If you've heard about the imperial cult, cool. Basically what it is that the emperors, starting with Julius Caesar, started to get this idea about themselves that they were gods. Now, to whatever extent they believed in that themselves isn't so much the point. The point was that everybody else bought into the idea. So if you lived in the Roman Empire, one of these ideas that started to spread very quickly through the early parts of the first century was this idea that the emperors are gods. Now, even if you didn't fully believe it, it was a great way to show honor to the emperor. If you wanted to say, hey, imperial family, look how much we admire and respect you, then you would build a temple, you would build an imperial cult area. And so in Corinth, this is very likely the imperial cult temple, which is a temple to Octavia, who was the sister of what became Emperor Augustus. Now, it's particularly important for Corinth to do this, because if you remember in the previous video, this is a city devoted and loyal to Rome. It was a Roman colony, and so all of its loyalty was towards the emperor. Philippi, exactly the same sort of thing. And so what we have here is a strong devotion to the Roman Empire, which has now become something of a religion. And that becomes very important for us when we come later on to other passages in Corinth. So as you can see, there's lots of different historical or different contextual things that are happening in Corinth, which make Corinth quite unique to any other city of the ancient world. And if you're a Corinthian, this is what you've been brought up to believe. This is what shapes your identity. By being a Corinthian, you believe, you buy into all of these ideas. And so like any person who comes to the Christian faith, you're going to bring that baggage. You're going to bring those ideas to this new faith. And some of those you have to be re-educated. You have to lay down some of those ideas or to reject some of those ideas. But for every Christian that comes into this faith, there's ideas that you bring from your previous life, from your surrounding culture, that either need to be adjusted or removed or whatever needs to happen with them. But they're there, and that's the important point. And they've been what shapes you. They've been what gives you an identity up until this point. And so the message of Christianity, in many ways, is a message of re-education. It's a message of coming to a different set of values, a different set of beliefs. And for Corinth, for the Corinthian Christians, they had only been Christians for a few years. If you remember, Paul came to the city. He writes a letter a few years later, as we're about to see. But prior to Paul coming, there was no such thing as Christianity. They'd never heard of Christianity before. And so this was all very, very new to them. And so what we find in these Corinthian letters isn't a particularly bad group of people that were so terrible that the world had never seen before. No, they were just Corinthians being Corinthians, who hadn't quite clued on to this idea that Christ overturns many of those ideas. And that's really the foundation for reading Corinthians. But we'll get into that in coming videos. But I'll see you in the next one. Hi there and welcome back. So what we've been discussing to this point has been, we're trying to come to understand better what it means to be a Corinthian. Now, to be a Corinthian means you come from Corinth, of course, but to be part of the city of Corinth, you're going to take on certain ideas and certain values that are unique to Corinth. Now, I've made the point very explicitly, and will continue to do so, that in so many ways and in so many of the bigger issues, Corinth was no different to any other city. But there were ways in which the city was a little bit unique. And so when you talk about a Corinthian, you're both talking about a product of the first century generally, but also something that's a little bit unique to that particular place and time. One of the unique elements of the city of Corinth is that Corinth, as I said, had been refounded by Julius Caesar. It had become a Roman city, specifically a Roman colony. But prior to it being refounded by, or destroyed and then refounded by the Romans, it was a Greek city. And it was a very powerful Greek city, one of the major city-states of that Greek world. And so when Rome came in and took over a city, they would, as much as possible, allow the city to carry on as they always have. So when the Romans came to Jerusalem, they didn't forbid worship of Yahweh. In fact, they said, can you pray to him for us? Can you pray to your God? Because we want to get as many of our gods on side as we can. Same thing in Athens. There's very little distinction or Romanness about Athens. It was always Athens. But Corinth had been destroyed. Corinth had been completely flattened and only a few buildings left standing. And so when the Romans came in, one of the important things that the Romans understood was the power or the effectiveness of architecture. What the Romans realized is that if you build an organized city, you're going to have organized people. If you have organized people, then you have people that are less likely to riot or to cause any sort of insurrections. And they learnt this the hard way, because Rome by the first century was just a mess. It was an absolute rabbit warren. There were streets running everywhere. There were streets that just ran into a dead end and nobody knew what was going on with it. It was just a city that had grown and grown, kind of like walking through Sydney. It's kind of just goes a bit of everywhere, and so the latest cities are a little bit more organized because they learnt from the initial ones, we got to do this thing better. So for the Romans, when they refounded cities, or when they built cities, they tried to keep them very organized. But the other thing about the Romans was they were pragmatic. If there was stuff there that they could use, why put more money into something that's already there? And so what you get in the architecture of Corinth, if you look at the picture, the diagram here, this is the forum, this is the main city centre of Corinth. Now, it was a much bigger city, but this is where all the action took place. The forum is always the